There are documents that were never meant to be seen, not because they don't exist, but because of what they confirm. Experiments conducted in controlled environments, funded, approved, and documented, but not always disclosed, not at the time, and not fully, even now. Because disclosure doesn't always mean transparency, and transparency doesn't always mean truth. Over the years, pieces have surfaced. Not all at once, not in a complete form, but in fragments, declassified reports, internal memos, references buried inside larger documents, programs mentioned briefly, then redacted, files released decades later, after the context had already faded. And when you start putting those pieces together, they don't tell one story. They reveal a pattern, one that doesn't align with what people assume is allowed, or what people assume is possible. They describe biological testing, human exposure, field experiments that extended beyond laboratories. And while each document tells only part of the story, together they begin to form something clearer, something harder to ignore. Because patterns don't require full information. They only require repetition. And the repetition is there. In some cases, substances were tested on populations without their knowledge, not announced, not disclosed. Aerosol dispersals, simulated releases, designed to measure spread, impact, response, not as theory, but as real-world trials. Cities became environments. Neighborhoods became test zones. People became variables. Unaware, uninformed, unprotected. And the results were recorded, analyzed, filed away, converted into data, into conclusions, into future planning. Because once something is measured, it can be used. There were also controlled experiments, subjects exposed under observation, reactions monitored, limits tested, responses documented, in environments where variables could be managed, where outcomes could be studied, repeated, refined, often justified under the same reasoning: national security, preparedness, understanding potential threats. Because to defend against something, you first have to understand it. That was the logic. And within that logic, almost anything can be justified. But logic doesn't remove consequence. And it doesn't erase the question of consent. It doesn't address who decides, what is acceptable, and who is allowed to be part of that decision. Because in many of these cases, the subjects didn't know. They weren't informed. They weren't given a choice. And that changes the nature of the experiment entirely. Because once consent is removed, the line shifts from research to something else, something harder to define. Some of these programs remained hidden for decades, not because they were unknown internally, but because they weren't meant to be public. They existed within systems designed to limit visibility, to restrict access, to control information. And when they were eventually revealed, they weren't presented as active operations. They were historical, closed, no longer relevant. At least that's how they were described. But the methods didn't disappear. The capability didn't vanish. Once something is developed, it becomes part of what's possible. It becomes a reference point, a foundation, something that can be built on, refined, improved. And biological research didn't stop. It evolved, became more advanced, more precise, more controlled, more targeted, which makes the earlier experiments more significant because they show the beginning, the willingness to test, to push boundaries, to operate in areas where oversight is limited or absent. And once that boundary is crossed, it doesn't simply reset. It moves. There are also gaps, documents that reference other documents, programs that are mentioned, but not fully detailed, sections redacted, information removed, pages missing, enough to confirm existence, but not enough to explain it completely. And that's not accidental, because partial information creates uncertainty. It confirms something happened without revealing how or why or to what extent. And that's where uncertainty remains, because declassification doesn't reveal everything. It reveals what can be revealed, what is no longer considered sensitive, or what no longer matters, or what no longer poses a risk to current operations. But that leaves a question. What still does? What remains classified? Because it's still relevant, because it's still active, because it still operates within systems that aren't visible. Because if something no longer matters, it can be released. But if it does matter, it stays hidden. And that distinction is important. The past provides context, but it doesn't define the present. It only shows what was possible, what was done, and what was considered acceptable at the time, which may not be as different from now as people assume, because systems don't reset. They evolve, they adapt, they refine, they continue. And the line between protection and experimentation isn't always clear. It shifts depending on perspective, depending on necessity, depending on who is making the decision.